Hello, friends. I hope you had a successful Hanukkah, and welcome to an exciting shiur with Rabbi Dr. Henry Abramson, exploring our holiest site, the temple. About our speaker, Henry Abramson serves as a dean of Touro University in Brooklyn, New York. Sorry, one sec. Slight glitch. Here we go. Okay. Henry Abramson serves as a dean of Touro University in Brooklyn, New York. A native of Northern Ontario, his online lectures have been viewed over 9 million times. His current project is a 3-volume history of the Jewish people, forthcoming from Koren Publishers in Jerusalem. It is an honor to have him with us. Thank you so much all for joining us in person, for all those who will be watching later. Thank you so much, Dr. Abramson. The floor is yours. You're on mute.
Thank you. I was just thinking it's kind of strange to say the floor is yours, because we are certainly not sharing a floor, not even sharing a room, but I guess the screen is yours or the microphone is yours. Anyways, I'm very grateful to be here and speaking with all of you. I should note, by the way, I just put it in the chat, I'm not a rabbi, just a regular guy. I don't know why people think I'm a rabbi. It just comes out like that, I guess. But my goal for today is to give you a very quick overview of what we know from a historical perspective of the temples in Jerusalem. I'm referring here in the plural, of course, because there were 2 temples, the first and the second temple, and maybe we'll have some opportunity to reflect on the larger ramifications of this history. We were originally planning to actually do this in 2 lectures, but we had some scheduling conflict, so I'm going to condense 2 already very complicated topics into 1 presentation, which is somewhat more difficult to do because I don't know very much about all of your backgrounds and how familiar you are with this complex history. So I've tried to craft this presentation for intelligent lay people who maybe have a certain degree of familiarity with the subject. For those of you who are much more invested into this historical period, I hope that you won't find it too superficial, but for the rest of you, I hope that this will be a useful overview. I'll share my screen now and just take you to my presentation. Here we go. Can everyone see this screen that shows what do we know about the temple? Just nod so I can tell if in fact you can see that. Yeah, okay, great. So the topic is, what do we know about the temple in Jerusalem and how do we know it? And in reality, that's one of the most complex questions for anything related to the biblical period, because as we shall see, there are really 2 broad extremes of opinion when it comes to how we deal with biblical text for historical purposes. The kind of 19th century perspective, and this is a little bit of a caricature because many historians will, it's hard to find anyone who sits on the extreme, but the maximalist perspective says, well, what are you talking about? The Bible is replete with historical data. If you read the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, the book of Chronicles, oh my gosh, those are fantastic works of history, the equal of any of the Greeks or Roman historians, Herodotus and Tacitus and so on. Really phenomenal works of history. And on the other hand, you have the other extreme, a school known as the minimalists, who say, we can't rely on any historical data percolating out of the biblical text for a whole host of reasons, which include, for example, from a historical as opposed to a theological perspective, we're not precisely sure who wrote these texts and when. Is the book of Daniel, for example, really describing events that occurred in Babylonia? Or is it actually describing a period of time several hundred years later and is merely set in the period of Babylonian captivity? These are really important and difficult questions that many biblical critics offer. Most historians, however, are loath to trash any kind of valuable data, even if it requires a heavy degree of interpretation to understand what exactly is the kernel of value from a historical perspective. And so most historians find themselves somewhere between the maximalists and the minimalists on these major questions. So when we're looking at the Bible as a historical source, a lot of the material that we want to really explore, including some of the major figures of the Bible, like King David, King Solomon, and so on, it's hard to really find good non-biblical data to flesh out the story, to corroborate it, and so on. So taking that kind of caveat about how we deal with the temple, the period that we're looking at today, a very long period of about 1,000 years, it depends on what we know is very much dependent on how we know it. If we take a kind of a fundamentalist approach, say, well, everything in the Bible is absolutely true, exactly the way it is read at face value, you say, well, there you go, you've got tons of history. What else is there to know? But if you take it from a minimalist perspective and say, wait a second, this is essentially an internal family story. We don't know exactly when these texts came to us, in what form, for what purpose. Can we really rely on them as history? Or do they fall into a different kind of category like literature or legend or mythology, things like that? These are very real questions that are asserted in the academy as we try to deal with this ancient period. So, but what do we know? What can we rely on, and how do we know it? The temple, of course, exists today, at least the Temple Mount exists today. It's an area several football fields in size. I could assume that when I say football, you would understand me to understand the game played with a ball and kicked with your feet, which would be fair enough, because I don't even know exactly how large a European football stadium is, but it's probably about the same size as an American football stadium. And the Temple Mount encompasses several of those football fields. The earliest Temple Mount, as we shall see in a moment, was quite a bit smaller, probably closer to one football field. There are several structures on the Temple Mount today, despite the fact that it originally housed the Jewish temples, the first temple and then later the second temple. It has been built up since it was razed by the Romans, and it has several important Muslim structures on it. To the left, the iconic Dome of the Rock, which is built over a remarkable slab of basalt that is understood to be the foundation stone in Jewish tradition, the navel of the world. And then to the south, you see the Silver Dome, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. These are all built on the enlarged Temple Mount grounds today. So we have this physical location today. What do we know about its biblical history? So we have several different places where we can go to garner data about this history. The first, of course, is the Tanakh. The Hebrew scriptures give us a very detailed description of the architectural creation of the temple, the grounds for the creation of the temple, its dates of existence, and so on. And here's the basic schematic that we get from Tanakh, which is corroborated by a lot of data, but once you get past the sort of skeletal structure of this chronology, it's hard to find really quality details about what that temple was like and what Jewish life was surrounding that temple as its ritual center. The first temple is built famously by King Solomon. One of the things that is exceptionally valuable about the Bible as a historical source is it gives us extremely rich, to use Shakespearean as a comparative device would, shame the Bible, because in many ways it's far more pithy and powerful than even Shakespeare's expression. The Bible gives us tremendous, character development and details about the major figures involved. King David wishes to create this temple, but God invalidates him from doing so. The text says because he is a warlike individual, a man of blood, but that task eventually devolves upon his son, King Solomon, who was associated with this first major center. It is essentially a graduation from the portable tabernacle, which was described in the book of Exodus through Deuteronomy as traveling through the desert with the Jews, I shouldn't really say Jews, to say the Israelites, but I will habitually refer to them as Jews anyways, because that term really develops later. But the tabernacle is later graduated into a permanent physical fixed structure as opposed to this wandering structure under King Solomon. Then it is destroyed dramatically some 400 years later by the Babylonian conqueror Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar then in turn is destroyed by the Persian forces, who allow the Jews to return and rebuild the second temple. So the seam of time between the destruction of the first and the reconstruction of the second all occur within the 500s before the Common Era. The dates that are typically given are 586 before the Common Era for the destruction, 519 for the reconstruction of the second temple. That second temple then stands all the way up until the first millennium, and it is destroyed in the context of the Roman-Jewish War that erupted in the year 66 of the Common Era, and ultimately the destruction of the temple is the most dramatic concluding event of that disastrous conflict, disastrous, of course, for the Jews of Judea. And then finally, the structures, so it's basically, it's a flat land. It's used by the Romans literally as a landfill, as a refuse dump. And that was quite intentional because the Romans wanted to wipe out any, sense of Jewish nationhood, of statehood, and prevent any further rebellions. They were unsuccessful in this regard. There was a second major rebellion under Bar Kokhba around the year 132. And of course, the Jews as a civilization far outlasted the Roman Empire and ultimately, amazingly, were able to return to Jerusalem, although they have not, of course, rebuilt the temple a third time. The structures that were then cleared away and built on top of that by the Muslims, the Dome and the Rock that I showed you earlier, those were constructed in the 8th century, so quite a bit later after this period. We're going to focus primarily on the 1,000 years from the reign of King Solomon, the vast majority of which is only supported by the data that we have in the Tanakh itself. And then we have much better data to confirm its destruction under Nebuchadnezzar in the 6th century and its rebuilding. And then, of course, a lot of data about the destruction of the second temple in the year 70. If you have a look at this remarkable reconstruction of the Temple Mount itself, not so much the actual temple buildings, but the larger structure by Leon Rittmeyer, who does a lot of amazing archaeological reconstructions. You can see that originally the Temple Mount was square, and that's the way it was under King Hezekiah, somewhat after King Solomon. And there's kind of like a stub of a building attached here because we don't know precisely what that first temple looked like. And then it is expanded slightly under the pre-Maccabean Seleucid king named Antiochus Epiphanes. That is, of course, the Antiochus of Hanukkah infamy. By the way, what time is it over there by you? It's probably about 9 or 10 p.m. Is that correct? So if that's the case, it's still Hanukkah by us here. So I'm still sort of working off my sufganiot, and I have a couple of Hanukkah things to share with you. The Hashmonaim, that is that Maccabean generation that fought off the Seleucids and reasserted Jewish independence, expanded the Temple Mount somewhat. There's actually evidence of this in the construction of the exterior walls to this very day. And then King Herod, who was a pro-Roman king of Israel, who ruled for several decades, a very, very powerful and effective leader, who was quite brutal, but his brutality was matched by his passion for public works. He had all kinds of amazing construction going on throughout Israel, major ports and aqueducts and coliseums and things like that. And he built up, of course, the primary ritual center of Jerusalem, the temple, with this massive expansion of the Temple Mount. The walls that that we see today, especially the Western Wall, are largely walls built by King Herod. And of course, he really expanded the beauty and grandeur of the temple structures themselves, although the Romans destroyed them, so we don't know precisely what they look like. And this is what the Temple Mount looks like today, with the Muslim structures on top of it, roughly in the same place where we believe that the actual temple structures originally stood. So that's the geography of the area that we're going to look at, and most of that data we can derive from Tanakh without too much controversy. Now, we also have, and this is especially useful for historians, we have corroborating data from outside Tanakh. Tanakh, of course, is incredibly valuable, but it is written with a particular perspective. It is written largely to reinforce a particular Judeo-centric view of the world, to emphasize the importance of Jewish worship and so on. And historical data is largely subordinated to that overarching goal. We have, however, outside of the Tanakh itself, some really interesting written works that provide us with data that usually fits very well with the biblical account. On the left, you see a picture of Josephus, the great Jewish historian of the first century. He lived from about 37 to about the year 99 of the Common Era. That is the first century of the Common Era. This is a 15th century rendition of him from the Nuremberg Chronicle. Josephus is an amazingly talented historian with a phenomenal flair for the dramatic, and he spent his entire career writing about Jewish history. He was the first major Jewish historian, and by and large, the most successful. But he has a lot of baggage that makes it difficult for us to somewhat understand what Josephus is all about. Just looking at his background for a moment, he was, he writes about himself quite a bit. He actually wrote an autobiography, and all of his works have significant autobiographical information contained within them. He was apparently a very precocious young individual, so bright that at age 14, the elders of Jerusalem were seeking him out for guidance on matters of Torah and halakha, which is kind of hard to believe, but we only have Josephus's word for it. And he became early on quite enamored of Rome. Rome was, of course, in control of Judea at that time. When war broke out against the Romans, something which he was not enthusiastic about, he was actually appointed to be the commander of the north, the commander of the Galilean forces. And he acquitted himself with great credit. He was apparently a brilliant warrior and strategist. We know this because he tells us so himself. However, he was ultimately forced to surrender to the Emperor Vespasian, who was surrounding the city Yotapata, where he and his soldiers were hiding out. Rather than surrender immediately, however, a group of them were gathered in an underground cave, and it was inevitable that they were going to be found. So Josephus suggested to the rest of them that, hey, it would be such a shame if we were not to go down fighting, if we were to be captured and then sold into slavery or who knows what. Wouldn't it be so much more dignified for us to commit mass suicide? And I know what we should do. We should draw lots, and rather than each person killing themselves, which would be, he said, an affront to God. He says rather what we should do is we'll draw lots, and the first person will kill 2 or 3 other people, then we'll draw lots again, and the next person will kill 2 or 3 other people, and so on until we finally are left with one person alive who will be the only one who has to kill himself. Remarkably, Josephus ends up, they all say, okay, let's do it. But remarkably, Josephus ends up being one of the last 2 guys alive, and he turns to the other guy, and the 2 of them are supposed to commit suicide, and he says, wait, maybe we should rethink this for a second. And he suggests, maybe we should be around to tell the tale of the heroism of our friends and things like that. And so they decide not to end their lives, and they surrender to Vespasian. When they come out, Josephus cleverly tells Vespasian that he believes he is going to be the new emperor, that in fact Josephus has prophetic powers. He sees that he will be ultimately elevated to be the emperor of Rome. Josephus decides not to kill him right away, but keeps him as a captive. And then later, when he sees Josephus's tremendous value as a culture broker, as someone who could act as a translator, not only for the language, but also for the scenario, someone who knows the terrain, someone who knows the culture, and so on. So he ends up hiring Josephus as his Jewish expert. At this point, he is also elevated to become the emperor of Rome. He's called to Rome, where he ultimately becomes the emperor, and he leaves Josephus behind in the tow of his son, Titus, who leads the rest of the war against the Jews. Josephus writes a remarkable, amazingly, hugely valuable account of that war called the Jewish War. And then he goes on to write a massive multi-volume history of the Jewish people called Jewish Antiquities, all in Greek for a literary audience. He's hugely popular. He goes back with Titus after the war to Rome, where he is a celebrity. He's like on Oprah every night talking about his next book. And he's estranged from his people because, after all, he did turn coat. He did become a traitor to the Jewish cause. But at the same time, he's also trapped in his Jewish identity, because that's his job now, is to present Judaism to the rest of the world. And every single word he writes, and this is returning to our question of how can we rely on Josephus, every single word he writes is for the reading pleasure of his patron / captor, Titus. So he wants to, portray the Jews in a positive light, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to portray the Romans in a negative light. He wants to somehow make the Jews like worthwhile enemies of the Romans, valorous, and so on. But he remains our primary source for almost everything that happens in the first century, and an extremely important source for periods before it. So even though a lot of the data we have about the temple comes from Josephus, and Josephus is a really complicated historian to work with, nevertheless, he's quite prolific, and he provides us with a tremendous amount of useful material. We also have a tremendous amount of material written by the rabbis, and these are somewhat less suspect in terms of their complicated allegiance to the Romans as opposed to the traditionalist Jewish community. But of course, the rabbis have an agenda too. The rabbis are, like Tanakh, wanting to validate a particular view of what Judaism is, not surprisingly, the rabbinic view of what Judaism is. And in the first century, that was not at all the only ideology that was circulating throughout Israel, claiming the hearts and minds of Jews, trying to pull them in one direction or another. Furthermore, a lot of the rabbinic writings that we rely on were typically written long after the temple was destroyed. Some of the oldest writings do go back to the temple period. For example, the Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, quite a few of those oral traditions can trace themselves back to statements made before the destruction of the temple. But the vast majority of rabbinic literature was set to writing long after. The Mishnah in particular was set to writing around the year 200. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. So even though the Mishnah is relying on earlier oral testimony, it is set to writing with the knowledge and the perspective of a destroyed temple. We also have non-rabbinic writings of a sectarian nature, such as the remarkable Dead Sea Scrolls, which were a huge cache, a library really, of documents that were collected by a nearby community in the Judean desert called the Khirbet Qumran, or the Qumran community. Here you can see the archaeological dig of the Qumran community, and it's believed that they stashed all of their valuable religious documents, some of which overlap the Tanakh. They have virtually every book of Tanakh. The only exception is the book of Esther, if I remember correctly. And they have lots more material in their library as well. All kinds of bizarre, kind of like apocalyptic texts and manuals of instruction. And it's scholars believe that this mysterious community, which was disbanded in the first century, was likely some kind of weird kind of Jewish ashram-like location where people practiced fairly ascetic rules of behavior, dining in silence, and lots of stages of spiritual development where people were slowly initiated into one stage after another stage and so on. All kinds of really bizarre things, which Josephus tells us about. He says he spent about 4 years in a community that sounds a lot like this must have been, where they were given a shovel and told that they can only defecate once a day outside of the camp, and the shovel was to take care of their own business, and they were not allowed to defecate at all on the Sabbath, which is kind of a bizarre sort of thing. But they were kind of bizarre people, I think, in many ways. The Dead Sea Scrolls, however, which were likely written by a group that sought to separate themselves from what they saw as the corrupt influences on the temple, have a lot of critical views of the temple, and the temple rituals were associated with it. And we can use these texts, albeit with a lot of care and consideration, to understand what happened in the temple itself. And then finally, the last group of texts, of course, are early Christian documents. Because even though obviously Christianity went in a rather different direction after the destruction of the temple, nevertheless, the earliest Christian documents, the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for example, maybe some of the writings of Paul, they're written really in the first, first 4 or 5 decades after the destruction of the temple, maybe a little bit earlier, and they give us some perspective from, again, a community that sees itself as taking a different trajectory than the rest of the Jewish world. But the vast majority of all of the authors are in fact Jewish, who see Judaism going in a different direction. And they have a critical viewpoint of the temple. This famous scene, which is actually a 16th century representation of it, and the author of the painting, Peter Peruka the Elder, obviously had no clue what the temple looked like, but he sort of like created this Oriental-like structure and described the various hangers-on around it, engaged in various disreputable activities. Nevertheless, the Christian writings do give us some sense of what the temple meant to them, and by extension, we can derive some historical data. So those are just a sampling of the kinds of literary texts that we can bring to bear to understand something about the temple, in particular, the Second Temple, where these are much more numerous. And then finally, most fascinatingly, I think, is there's tons of really cool archaeological evidence. Now, the temple grounds themselves have never been excavated for obvious reasons. This is an active holy site, revered intensely by Jews and Muslims, and to a somewhat lesser degree by Christians. The idea of going in there with backhoes or even with toothbrushes is hotly contested. And so it's simply, not happened. There have been a couple of moments where there were some renovations conducted to the Temple Mount, sometimes conducted in a very inappropriate manner. But nevertheless, going through the landfill afterwards has resulted in some remarkable finds. But for the time being, the kinds of tools that archaeologists have been able to look around the exterior areas of the temple and look at the structure of the Temple Mount itself for many clues as to the history of the region. One of the most fascinating areas was described actually in yesterday's New York Times. I just chose it because for our class, simply because it is really so timely, is using, what was the term they used there? It's something like magnetopaleontology. I think I got that term totally wrong. I mangled it. But basically, apparently, when you heat something up to a super hot temperature, if it has certain kind of chemical contacts in it, it changes the magnetic polarity of the materials inside that thing that you're looking at. And you can actually calculate the date upon which that occurred. This, to me, sounds like, it's kind of magic. I studied all of my history in the humanities department, and at a certain point when scientists start talking, my eyes start glazing over. But apparently this is true, and new scholars have been working on this, PhD candidates in Hebrew University, and looking at the remains of areas that were destroyed and that historically we've always associated with the various destructions of Jerusalem. And they are confirming, in fact, that, when we do this kind of magneto-paleo dating, we can actually find that it confirms the accounts that we have in Tanakh, and really quite fascinating. And then there's a conventional archaeology where they basically dig things up and find things that make perfect sense with the historical record. Sometimes they find things that make no sense with the historical record, and that's when historians and archaeologists tend to clash. But for example, here, discovering Babylonian-style arrowheads, their Scythian design used by the Babylonians, from the destruction layer, where archaeologists will actually work with stratigraphy. They will actually layer the finds in the ground, and they'll be able, by where it is found, to actually date it to a particular time. So a lot of the material that we'll be discussing has been verified by archaeologists and is really quite useful in that regard. Okay, so that's kind of like the introduction, which took more than half of this class, but tells us how we know. What we know is very much predicated on how we know it. So looking at the first temple, this is one artist's rendition of the first temple. In order to do this, we have to rely entirely on the literary descriptions in Tanakh, primarily in the book of Kings, which has very lengthy descriptions, but sometimes difficult to decipher. But as you can see, it is a fairly modest structure by modern standards. The temple, as it was renovated by Herod, was quite a bit more magnificent. The Talmud, again, written much, much later, about 1,000 years after the destruction of the first temple, tells us that the first temple was characterized by a whole series of miracles. That, for example, you would put the sacrificial offering on the altar and fire would come from heaven to consume it. That's a pretty obvious and straightforward sign of divine favor. The second temple, on the other hand, although it was on its externalities far more grand, it didn't have any of those miraculous occurrences associated with it. So that's perhaps the most significant difference from a theological point of view between the first and the second temple. Of course, we don't have any other data to tell us about that. But the temple does tell us a lot about the nature of Jewish society. The impetus for the temple, as described in Tanakh, is that people were essentially going their own way and setting up DIY temples all over Israel. They were setting up these high places, the Hebrew term is bamot, and they were essentially offering their own sacrifices for a whole host of reasons. And there was no rule that said you couldn't do that. And so in the book of Samuel, David is enjoined to end this practice and to centralize worship in Jerusalem. First by bringing the movable tabernacle there, and then later by constructing a permanent housing for the altar and so on. As I mentioned earlier, it was not carried out by David, but rather by his son. So looking at the archaeological finds in Israel, we discover that in fact this was quite effective. There are remarkably few remains from the period of the first temple of these local sacrificial locations, which suggests, it's an argument from silence, an argument we didn't find any, so therefore it must mean that this is happening. You can't really make that argument, but it does definitely support the notion to some degree. It's kind of like, when they study the landfill that is often filled with bones of animals that are consumed, and you see from the first century in particular that they're a vanishing number of non-kosher animals are consumed in areas known to be settled by Jews, which seems to be a fairly strong argument for the fact that the Jews were keeping kosher. But let's move on from that because I don't want to get too far distracted. Where we see the exceptions to the rule are especially illustrative. One of the most important exceptions to the rule is on Mount Gerizim, which is outside modern-day Shechem or Nablus, and this is the location of the Samaritan temple. The Samaritans were a group of people who are known to us from the biblical account as being foreign imports to the land of Israel by the Assyrians, who specifically practiced a lot of population transfers in general to try and quell incipient rebellions by inserting foreign groups and then, trying to make sure that the local indigenous population doesn't have the same kind of power base. The Samaritans, however, have a very different account of their history. They say, no, we're not brought in from some outside source. We're the real Jews. And you guys made up all kinds of other stuff that does not comport with our original history. We're the people who came here from Egypt and so on. And the Samaritans continue to exist in Israel today, primarily in the Shechem Nablus area. Fascinating population. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim, which may have looked a lot like the temple in Jerusalem. It was destroyed, however, a number of times and destroyed by the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim in particular. So the ruins that we're looking at right now are later structures that were built on top of it by the Romans and elsewhere, using this high point as a fortress. But nevertheless, we do have at least one example in Israel of a rival temple that existed for some 100 years. Then moving to Egypt, you have an especially fascinating temple in the region of a place called Elephantine, which is in the Upper Nile. It's called the Upper Nile, even though it's to the south, because the Nile River flows from south to north. So it is like upriver on the Nile, the Upper Nile. And in Elephantine, there was originally a Jewish military outpost, most likely set up during the period that the Persians ruled the area, although possibly quite a bit earlier as well. And they left behind as well a temple, which again seemed to function a lot like the temple in Jerusalem. There are actually excavations of that temple as well, which give us some sense of the size and maybe the way it functioned. And it seemed to be largely a parallel to the temple, even though the temple in Jerusalem was supposed to be the one and only. There's also been preserved, because of the very arid climate of the region, Aramaic correspondence between the Jews of Elephantine and the Jews of Judea. That's absolutely fascinating, telling us what this community was like. Judea was, for example, trying to convince or at least instruct the Jews of Elephantine, despite the fact that they had a functioning temple, just reminding them that on Passover, they're not allowed to drink beer, for example. Really interesting kind of communication. But the reality that the rival temples to Jerusalem were so limited in number suggests that the original purpose of that first temple was largely achieved. On the other hand, another institution was developed, the synagogue. The term synagogue means literally gathering place. It is a Greek translation of the term Beit Knesset. It was also referred to somewhat interchangeably as a prosuke, which means a place of prayer. And we have a wide variety of archaeological data that support the creation of these kind of like small gathering places, which were not considered places of ritual sacrifice, but were, like the Greek terms, somehow intended for the study of Jewish law and for communal prayer. We have an incredible number of archaeological artifacts to support that, including this Theodotos inscription, which you might be able to recognize it for what it is. It is one of the oldest Jewish traditions ever. Once you have a synagogue, you have to have a plaque. And this is a plaque from the, praising the donor for supplying the funds to build the synagogue and so on, saying nice things about him and about his family and so on. And we have plaques everywhere. Like, just go to your local synagogue, you'll find hundreds of plaques. There are plaques throughout Jewish history. Some of them are quite fascinating. This is from Smyrna in the 3rd century. This is actually a transcription of it, written in Greek, and it is written in honor of a woman named Rufina, who is referred to as the archisynagogus, the head of the synagogue. And in fact, remarkably, we have a lot of Jewish women, who are serving in that particular capacity. And this particular inscription was actually not in a synagogue. It's in a graveyard. Specifically warns people that if they abuse the graves in any way, they'll have to pay fines and so on. So really quite fascinating. But this first temple is ultimately destroyed by the the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar. Here's a 17th century representation of that, completely ahistorical, but still a very evocative piece of art that describes that conflagration. And that first temple comes to an end in the year 586 as a result of local conflict with the imperial ruler in Babylonia. Moving to the Second Temple period, that Babylonian empire falls to the neighboring Persian Empire. And under Cyrus, there is an interesting new policy that is promulgated throughout this large multinational empire, that Cyrus wants people to go back and invest in their own local traditions. This Cyrus Cylinder, which is a document that records a series of dictates by the king, doesn't mention the Jews specifically, but essentially it says proclaim religious freedom for everybody, go back to your lands, rebuild your temples, and so on. And that's in fact what the Jews do. They return to Jerusalem after many of them were exiled to Babylonia. They have a lot of challenges at first. They're described primarily in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But they take to this new environment quite effectively. There's some fascinating archaeological remains from that era, such as this coin, a ma'ah, which has in writing on the right, Yahud, the Jewish region of what would be later Judea. And it's interesting because it has this extremely evocative bas-relief of a face. One of the things that is most puzzling about this ancient Jewish period is that the Jews seem to, at some point, suddenly remember the commandment about making graphic images of any living being, and they suddenly cease that for about 200-300 years, and then eventually they get back to it. But in the Persian period, clearly they're making coins with images, something which in the Maccabean period onward, they will stop entirely. The Maccabean period is really what we get to next. So you remember the Persians allow the Jews to come back in the 500s. In 519, most likely, they rebuild the Second Temple, and it exists for a couple hundred years until Alexander the Great comes charging out of Macedonia and conquers basically the known world. He dominates the Eastern Mediterranean, taking over Egypt. Of course, Israel is in the way there, and he goes right through Central Asia, blows across to northern India, and Pakistan, regions like that. And what's fascinating about Alexander's period is that although he died a very young man, possibly of alcohol poisoning, he united this vast and really quite diverse region under a single way of thinking, the Hellenistic way of thinking, with Greek science and math and art and aesthetics. And the Jews loved it. The Jews were early adopters, which, since we are in the season of Hanukkah, caused a lot of internal tension, as some Jews essentially said, well, that's it. Greek culture is so vastly superior to our own. Why are we keeping anything? Let's completely dive into Greek culture. A traditionalist faction led by Matisyahu. I found myself very fortunate to actually found a photograph of Matisyahu. I didn't know that any existed. That's a joke. It's hard to tell a joke on Zoom, but I hope you get it. Matisyahu, who was a traditionalist living at Modi'in, sparks a rebellion which eventually blows up the entire country, and the Greeks, who are at that point ruled from Syria, hence the Syrian Greeks, are eventually driven out, and the Jews under a new Maccabean dynasty, the Hashmonaim, are able to assert a level of independence in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. Tremendously important battles, like this battle here, which shows the Syrians attempting to use these terrifying weapons of war, these war elephants with the archers on the top in turrets, raining down death on the Jews. And here Elazar, the brother of Yehuda Maccabee, bravely dives under one of them and stabs it from below, and is unfortunately crushed by the falling elephant and dies with that huge creature. Just a quick aside, I don't want to take too much time, but I've always enjoyed this, and it is, after all, still Hanukkah here in New York City. This particular dramatic moment, which is described in the book of Maccabees, was so appealing to European illustrators in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries that they really wanted to reproduce it in their illuminated manuscripts. The only problem was nobody knew exactly what an elephant actually looked like. And so you have all kinds of like really fanciful representations of elephants. This one looks sort of like some kind of cat with a long nose. This one's sort of like a salamander type creature. The ears are completely wrong. This one is my favorite. I think it inspired Dr. Seuss with that kind of trumpet-like horn. So it's very amusing. Look at these medieval representations. But under the Persians, the Jews were able to rebuild their temple. Under the Hashmonaim, they actually expanded the temple, and the temple once again became truly the central ritual pivot around which all Jewish life revolved. We move to the final period, and then I'll have a few minutes available for discussions. The Hashmonaim enter a period of decline. Ultimately, they succumb to many of the things they originally rebelled against at the beginning of the revolt. And the Romans come in the year 63. They find that the Jews are at the very beginning of yet another civil war between the two sons of Shlom Tzion Hamalka. And Pompey simply says, okay, well, we're just going to take this territory for ourselves. And Judea becomes a Roman province. They are allowed a certain degree of independence. There are Jewish kings that exist at the pleasure of the Roman Republic, later Empire. But they essentially lose all their independence. And by the time you get to the 2nd century, dissatisfaction with Rome is so great that the war erupts in the year 66. The Romans ultimately, although they suffer some initial reversals of a rather remarkable nature, they ultimately bring in the best soldiers they have, and they totally crush the Jewish rebels, including Josephus, who at this time has turned coat and has joined the Roman side. In the month of Av of the year 70, they break through the temple walls into the center of the temple, and they set it on flame. This is the event which is commemorated every year by Jews on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, a day of great sadness because it represents the closing of a period in Jewish history and the severance of a specific relationship to God that the presence of the temple signified. That's not at all the end of Judaism, however, because the rabbis are able to articulate a fascinating post-temple Judaism that is largely based on the study of text, the acts of kindness, and the prayer in the synagogue that has allowed the Jews remarkably to preserve themselves to the present day. And with that, I think I have about 7 minutes left for questions. Thank you so much for your endurance through this long presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. If anyone has questions, they can throw them in the chat. They can let us know live in person here on Zoom. We'll give it a bit of time so people can ask. If not, we'll shut it off now, but people can feel free to ask.
It's been my experience that no one likes to ask the first question. So if somebody has the second question, we'll start with that.
Looks like we have one question in the chat. In the Second Temple, who had jurisdiction over the daily happenings?
Well, don't forget, Second Temple, we're talking about a period of 500 years with several different governing authorities, the Persians, and later the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, and then finally the Romans. For the most part, the Jews themselves had control over the daily occurrences in the temple. But by the time you get to Roman rule, there are definitely some measures taken by the Romans to try and control Jewish rebelliousness. Like, for example, the Romans would take hold of the priestly robes, and since the Kohen Gadol had to wear these special clothes while performing the avoda, they would have to actually ask the Romans for permission to borrow those clothes so they could perform the avoda. So that's an indication of the Jews had to ultimately cede a lot of authority to the Romans on the functioning of the temple. Also, a lot of interesting debate among the Jews who was in charge. The Talmud portrays a situation in which so much of the leadership of the temple ritual was commanded by the Herodians in particular, and it was largely corrupt, with the appointment of high priests who were really unworthy and in fact didn't last in the job. But the Pharisees, which would be the rabbis, were still consulted to a great degree on how exactly are we supposed to perform this ritual and so on. So still a certain amount of power sharing going on.
All right, here's another question. I'll read it out just so we can have it on the recording. So Milton asked, to which extent the Kohanim of the Second Temple era during the Roman occupations were involved in political affairs with Roman authorities? Also, how true is it that the Essenes were against the temple authorities?
Okay, so there's two questions there, but I'll answer both for the same price. The first question is, the Second Temple era, again, 500 years, lots of time. Even the Roman era itself extends for over a century. It's about 120 years. So we're generalizing over that large period. But if we look towards the end of that period, the Kohane, the high priests, were deeply involved in local intrigue and heavily dependent on Roman authority for their position. If you just look at the cycle of how fast they churn through the revolving doors of the Kahuna Gadola, it's remarkable. So definitely deeply involved in it. Occasionally, there would be some differences. Like, for example, one of the very last high priests attempted to set up some policies which were popular, like universal schooling, and he was almost immediately assassinated by Jewish factions that disagreed with him. The second question, how true is it that the Essenes were against the temple authorities? So the Essenes, or the Essene, were, we're not exactly sure who they were. The sole source we have for the Essene and what they believed is Josephus. So everything Josephus says has to be understood, what was trying to Josephus to get across. If, however, as many scholars do, we identify the Essenes with the Qumran community, and there are lots of things that seem to be kind of similar about them, then they were most certainly against the temple authorities. There's a certain amount of debate. Were they like rebel Pharisees? Were they rebel Sadducees? But they certainly wanted to separate and have nothing to do with those awful people. I would say that right now, sort of like the consensus is forming that they were very much against the entire Hashmonaic enterprise, and they viewed the Hashmonaim as betrayers of the fundamental trust of Judaism. That's a very sophisticated question.
And if anyone wants to unmute, they can ask a question as well.
Okay.
Hello.
I have a hard stop in 3 minutes because I got to jump into another meeting. But so I have 3 minutes.
I'll pass. Chanukah Sameach to you still.
Thank you.
Okay.
I guess that's it then.
Sure, we can call it there. I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you very much, Dr. Abramson. And if anyone wants to keep up with what we're doing at the Xabura, we've got our YouTube channel, we've got a podcast, and we've got a membership. Everyone can head to thechabura.com/join, check out what we're all about, what we're doing, and really appreciate everyone's time. Chanukah Sameach to all of us here in the US, and have a great day.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.